لماذا لا؟ Why not? Why not? Why not? لماذا أنا؟ Why me? Why me? Why me? لماذا الآن؟ Why now? Why now? Why now? لماذا هذا؟ Why this? Why this? Why this? لماذا ذاك؟ Why that? Why that? Why that? لماذا هنا؟ Why here? Why here? Why here? لماذا هناك؟ Why there? Why there? Why there? لماذا الانتظار؟ Why wait? Why wait? Why wait? لماذا تذهب؟ Why go? Why go? Why go? لماذا تغادر؟ Why leave? Why leave? Why leave? لماذا تسأل؟ Why ask? Why ask? Why ask? لماذا تبالي؟ Why care? Why care? Why care? لماذا تحاول؟ Why try? Why try? Why try? لماذا تبقى؟ Why stay? Why stay? Why stay? لماذا التغيير؟ Why change? Why change? Why change? لماذا تتوقف؟ Why stop? Why stop? Why stop? لماذا تبدأ؟ Why start? Why start? Why start? لماذا العجلة؟ Why rush? Why rush? Why rush? لماذا القلق؟ Why worry? Why worry? Why worry? لماذا تختبئ؟ Why hide? Why hide? Why hide? لماذا تكذب؟ Why lie? Why lie? Why lie? لماذا تساعد؟ Why help? Why help? Why help? لماذا تبكي؟ Why cry? Why cry? Why cry? لماذا تبتسم؟ Why smile? Why smile? Why smile? لماذا تنام؟ Why sleep? Why sleep? Why sleep? لماذا تحلم؟ Why dream? Why dream? Why dream? لماذا تتكلم؟ Why speak? Why speak? Why speak? لماذا تستمع؟ Why listen? Why listen? Why listen? لماذا تقاتل؟ Why fight? Why fight? Why fight? لماذا تجادل؟ Why argue? Why argue? Why argue? لماذا تحب؟ Why love? Why love? Why love? لماذا تكره؟ Why hate? Why hate? Why hate? لماذا تختار؟ Why choose? Why choose? Why choose? لماذا تقرر؟ Why decide? Why decide? Why decide? لماذا تشتكي؟ Why complain? Why complain? Why complain? لماذا تصدق؟ Why believe? Why believe? Why believe? لماذا ترفض؟ Why refuse? Why refuse? Why refuse? لماذا توافق؟ Why agree? Why agree? Why agree? لماذا لا توافق؟ Why disagree? Why disagree? Why disagree? لماذا المخاطرة؟ Why risk? Why risk? Why risk? لماذا تعاني؟ Why suffer? Why suffer? Why suffer? لماذا تنجح? Why succeed? Why succeed? Why succeed? لماذا تفشل? Why fail? Why fail? Why fail? لماذا تتغير? Why change? Why change? Why change? لماذا تنس? Why forget? Why forget? Why forget? لماذا تتذكر? Why remember? Why remember? Why remember? لماذا تؤمن? Why believe? Why believe? Why believe?